Welcome to Brain Vat. So, when we started the show 5 years ago, we thought it's going to be quite hard to get some of the greatest minds on. And we've really done an incredible job over the last couple of years. We've had Peter Singer, we've had Martha Nussbaum, but this guest was beyond our comprehension. To get this person on, I'm just beyond delighted. So, we welcome onto the show for the first time ever, John Stuart Mill. John, would you like to start with the thought experiment?
Imagine a woman named Sarah, who lives in a humble village and is already the mother of 3 young children. Her husband, James, toils diligently as a labourer to provide for their family, yet their means are scarcely sufficient to meet their needs. One day, Sarah discovers she is with child again. The weight of this realization presses upon her, for she knows that bringing another child into the world could strain their resources beyond bearing, possibly plunging the entire family into destitution. Moreover, Sarah's health has been fragile since the birth of her last child. Her physician warns that continuing with this pregnancy could pose serious risks to her well-being, perhaps even endangering her life and leaving her existing children without a mother. Faced with this dire predicament, Sarah contemplates whether to carry the pregnancy to term or to seek a means to end it. This situation compels us to consider the principles of individual liberty and the utilitarian aim of maximizing happiness while minimizing suffering. Should Sarah have the autonomy to make a decision concerning her own body and the welfare of her family? Or should societal norms and laws dictate that she must proceed, regardless of the potential harm to herself and her dependents? Through this tangible example, we are invited to examine whether it is just for society to impose its will upon her most personal choices, or whether allowing her the freedom to decide best serves the greater good for all involved.
That's a very interesting case, John. I want to separate out the problem of autonomy from the problem of utility. So I want to find out if we only want to focus on utility. So if we only want to understand what decision will have the best outcome for everyone involved from a utility perspective, what will make everyone happiest, what do you think the correct thing for Sarah to do is?
From a strictly utilitarian perspective, the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people affected by the decision. In Sarah's situation, continuing with the pregnancy poses significant risks to her health, which could lead to her untimely death and leave her existing 3 children motherless. This outcome would undoubtedly cause profound sorrow and hardship for her family. Moreover, the addition of another child would strain their already limited resources, potentially plunging the entire family into deeper poverty. This could result in inadequate nourishment, education, and opportunities for all the children, thereby diminishing their future prospects and overall well-being. On the other hand, if Sarah chooses to terminate the pregnancy, she preserves her health and remains able to care for her existing children. The family's limited resources can be concentrated on providing better care and opportunities for them, thereby increasing their overall happiness and potential for a fulfilling life. Therefore, considering the consequences of both choices, it appears that the decision to end the pregnancy would result in the greatest net happiness and the least amount of suffering for all parties involved. From the utilitarian standpoint, which seeks to maximize well-being and minimize harm, Sarah's choice to terminate would be the morally preferable action.
So, John, I've got two questions for you. The first is there a danger in setting a rule which allows women to get an abortion, which then devalues the value of life generally? And while it might be that it's good for Sarah's family, that it would be bad for society as a whole. And the second is, given that it would uplift Sarah's family if she had the abortion, what if she performed an act of infanticide and decided to reduce the number of children that she has down to 1? And that would lead to more time for her, more autonomy, and more money for the remaining child. Would that be what utilitarianism requires?
Regarding your first question about the potential danger of allowing women the choice of abortion and whether it might devalue life generally, I believe that granting individuals the autonomy to make deeply personal decisions does not diminish the value of life, but rather affirms the importance of individual liberty. a cornerstone of a just society. By respecting a woman's right to choose, we acknowledge the complex circumstances that can surround such decisions. This respect for personal autonomy contributes to the overall well-being of society by promoting happiness and reducing unnecessary suffering. It fosters a community where individuals are trusted to make moral choices, thereby strengthening societal bonds rather than weakening them. As for the concern that what benefits Sarah's family might be detrimental to society, it's important to consider that empowering individuals often leads to greater societal good. When people are allowed to make choices that align with their circumstances and well-being, they are more likely to contribute positively to society. Restricting personal freedoms, on the other hand, can lead to resentment and diminish the collective happiness that utilitarianism strives to achieve. Addressing your second question about whether under a utilitarian framework it would be acceptable for Sarah to commit infanticide to improve her family's situation. Here we must draw a critical moral distinction. Infanticide involves the deliberate ending of a life that has already begun independent existence, a being who is a member of our moral and social community. It would erode trust, security, and the fundamental ethical principles that hold society together. While utilitarianism seeks to maximize overall happiness, it also requires us to consider the rights and welfare of all individuals affected by an action. The harm caused by infanticide far outweighs any potential benefits to the family, leading to greater overall suffering. Therefore, it would not be justified within a utilitarian framework. Protecting innocent life is essential to maintaining a society where happiness and well-being can flourish for all. In summary, while supporting a woman's autonomy in making decisions about her own body aligns with utilitarian principles by promoting greater happiness and reducing suffering, this does not extend to actions that inflict direct harm on others who are already part of our moral community. The prevention of harm is a fundamental aspect of ethical considerations, and preserving innocent life is paramount in upholding the greater good.
I take it that your harm principle, so not harming others within the moral community, is not really a moral principle. It's more of a political principle. So the state is obligated to prevent us from harming others. But that's not really a moral principle. Sometimes the ethical thing to do will be to harm someone in order to prevent a greater harm. So, for example, it would be perhaps to stop a Nazi soldier from entering your home by shooting the Nazi soldier so that the Nazi soldier can't kill your greater family. So I take it that that harm principle really has to do with your political theory and not your moral theory. But I'd like to ask a further question, which is, why do you think that the fetus, the unborn child, is not part of the moral community? Insofar as the child can suffer, and there is scientific evidence to suggest that fetuses can suffer, why do you think that it shouldn't be considered part of the moral community? And if it is part of the moral community, then doesn't your harm principle also extend to the fetus?
Firstly, concerning the harm principle as a political versus a moral principle. While it's true that I articulated the harm principle to delineate the limits of state intervention, it is deeply rooted in moral philosophy. The principle asserts that the only justification for exercising power over any member of a civilized community against their will is to prevent harm to others. This concept bridges the moral and political realms by providing a foundation for both individual ethics and societal laws. In situations where harming one may prevent greater harm to others, such as your example of defending one's family against a violent aggressor, the principle accommodates such actions under the umbrella of minimizing overall harm and maximizing well-being. Thus, the harm principle is flexible enough to account for complex moral dilemmas where harm might be necessary to prevent a greater injustice. Now, addressing your further question about the moral status of the fetus, the determination of when a being becomes part of the moral community is indeed a delicate matter. If we consider that a fetus is capable of suffering and has interests akin to those of a born child, it would naturally warrant moral consideration. However, we must also weigh this against the rights and well-being of the mother, who is an autonomous individual with established relationships, responsibilities, and a clear capacity for suffering. The moral community, as I conceive it, comprises individuals who participate in social and moral relations. Those who can engage with others, have preferences, and contribute to the collective welfare. A fetus, while possessing the potential for such participation, has not yet actualized these qualities. Its capacities for consciousness and suffering are also subjects of scientific and philosophical debate. Moreover, the potential harm to the fetus must be balanced against the actual and immediate harm that may befall the mother and her existing children. If carrying the pregnancy to term poses significant risks to the mother's health, threatens the family's stability, or leads to greater overall suffering, then prioritizing the well-being of those already integrated into the moral community becomes a pressing ethical consideration. In applying the harm principle, we must consider the consequences of our actions on all affected parties. The goal is to minimize harm and maximize happiness for the greatest number. While the fetus represents potential life, the mother's autonomy and the welfare of her existing family carry substantial moral weight. Denying her the choice could result in greater harm, not only to herself, but to those who depend upon her. Therefore, while I acknowledge that the fetus has moral significance, I contend that the harm principle does not extend to it in the same manner as it does to sentient autonomous individuals within the moral community. The rights of the mother, coupled with the utilitarian aim of promoting the greatest good, support the position that she should have the autonomy to make decisions concerning her pregnancy. In essence, this is not a dismissal of the moral considerations surrounding the fetus, but a recognition of the complex interplay between potential life and existing lives. It calls for a nuanced ethical evaluation, one that carefully weighs all factors to arrive at a decision that upholds both individual liberty and the greater good.
So, John, you're quite famous for protecting the right to free speech. And so I want you to think about the following situation. Imagine that you have someone who is incredibly persuasive and they write a treatise which convinces many people to ban abortion, and basically many mothers who are pregnant and whose lives would be better if they had abortions will choose not to do so or be publicly shamed if they do so. And so there'll be that effect. And also in the same treatise, they convince many people that infanticide would be a good thing. Do you think that publication should be allowed to go to print, or should it be banned?
Regarding the anti-abortion arguments, even if they cause discomfort or social pressure, I would argue that suppressing such opinions is not justified. Allowing these views to be openly discussed enables society to challenge and scrutinize them. Silencing dissenting voices can hinder the discovery of truth and prevent meaningful dialogue. However, the advocacy of infanticide is a profoundly different matter. Promoting such an act directly incites harm against innocent lives and violates the fundamental principles of a moral society. The harm principle, which I uphold, states that the actions, and by extension, speech of individuals, should be limited only to prevent harm to others. When speech crosses the line from expressing an opinion to encouraging unlawful and harmful actions, it becomes permissible and indeed necessary for society to intervene. Advocating for infanticide poses a clear and immediate danger to vulnerable members of the community, and suppressing such incitement aligns with the protection of societal well-being. In summary, while I staunchly support the freedom of expression, this liberty is not absolute. It must be weighed against the potential for direct harm to others. Therefore, I would contend that the treatise's publication should be allowed insofar as it debates abortion, but the portions that advocate for infanticide should be prohibited to prevent the incitement of grievous harm.
That's a very interesting answer. I would like you to return to something you said earlier, which is that what makes someone part of the moral community is that they enter into relations with other members of the moral community. But on that reasoning, infanticide should be fine, given that children, it seems, don't really relate, especially young infants, don't really relate to the rest of the moral community. If your point is that the mother or the father of that infant, they relate to the infant, well, then that seems to also be the case with the fetus. The mother and father both relate quite strongly to the fetus. And if your point is that maybe the young infant does with the fetus, the mother, and just imagine for a moment that the relationship between the parents and the infant is very strained. maybe this infant is straight, and a fetus that is not relating to the moral community in as strong a way, but seems to have a more positive relationship to the community insofar as it has any relationship at all. Let's say the mother is very excited to have the child, then doesn't it seem like infanticide would be the better option?
The inclusion of a being in the moral community hinges on factors such as sentience, consciousness, and the capacity to experience pleasure and pain. Infants, even at a very young age, are sentient beings who can feel pain, express emotions, and interact with their surroundings. They possess an independent existence and have begun to form relationships, however rudimentary, with those around them. Their potential for future development into autonomous individuals grants them a significant moral standing. In contrast, a fetus, particularly in the early stages of pregnancy, has not yet actualized these capacities to the same extent. While it possesses the potential for life, it does not have an independent existence separate from the mother. The mother's rights, autonomy, and well-being are intimately connected to the fetus, and her interests carry substantial moral weight in decisions regarding the pregnancy. Regarding the scenario where parents have a strained relationship with their infant, perhaps due to severe postpartum depression or other distressing circumstances, it is indeed a tragic situation. However, the solution cannot ethically involve ending the life of the infant. Society has mechanisms in place, such as social services and adoption, to support families in crisis and to ensure the welfare of the child. Infanticide would not only harm the innocent child, but also erode the moral fabric of society, leading to greater overall suffering. The utilitarian principle seeks to maximize happiness and minimize suffering for the greatest number. Permitting infanticide would set a dangerous precedent, undermining trust and security within the community. It would inflict profound harm, not just on the immediate parties involved, but on societal well-being as a whole. Moreover, the relationships that infants form, even if not fully developed, are significant. They have begun to engage with the world and others in a way that a fetus has not yet achieved. The moral obligations we have toward them are stronger because of their independent existence and their integration into the social sphere. In the case of a mother who is excited to have a child, the fetus represents a positive potential that aligns with her well-being and happiness. Denying her the choice to carry the pregnancy to term would infringe upon her autonomy and could lead to unnecessary suffering. In summary, while both fetuses and infants hold moral significance, the key difference lies in their level of development, independence, and capacity for relationships. Infanticide cannot be justified within my ethical framework because it constitutes a direct harm to a sentient being who is already part of our moral community. Abortion, particularly when considering the rights and well-being of the mother, can be morally permissible when it serves to minimize overall harm and respects individual autonomy. By carefully weighing the rights, interests, and potential harms involved, we strive to make ethical decisions that promote the greatest good while upholding the fundamental principles that sustain a just and compassionate society.
Well, never in my life did I think we'd get an opportunity to interview John Stuart Mill about abortion. And that's not all, folks. We're going to ask Immanuel Kant what he has to say. So, Mr. Kant, could you start with a thought experiment?
Imagine a woman named Clara who lives in a small town. Clara is married and has 2 young children. Her husband works hard to provide for the family, but they struggle to make ends meet. One day, Clara discovers she is expecting a 3rd child. Worried about their financial situation and how they will care for another baby, Clara considers ending the pregnancy. She believes that by doing so, she can better provide for her existing children and relieve the burden on her husband. In this situation, Clara faces a difficult choice between terminating the pregnancy to ease her family's hardships or carrying the child to term despite the challenges. From my perspective, taking the life of the unborn child to alleviate personal difficulties is not morally permissible. Every human life has inherent worth, and it is important to respect that dignity, regardless of the circumstances.
So, Kant, we just spoke with John Stuart Mill, and John is in favor of allowing women the rights to terminate on the grounds of their own autonomy. And part of the argument is that a fetus is not part of the moral community. On what basis do you think that it would affect the dignity of a being that has not yet been born to perform an abortion?
I believe that the dignity of a human being is intrinsic and not contingent upon their current ability to engage in society or reason. This dignity begins at the very inception of life. An unborn child, though not yet fully developed in its capacities, possesses the inherent potential to become a rational and moral being. This potential grants it a moral status that commands our respect. To perform an abortion is to treat this nascent life merely as a means to an end, perhaps to alleviate personal hardship or societal pressures, which undermines the principle of respecting individuals as ends in themselves. We must act according to maxims that we can will to be universal laws. If we were to accept that it is permissible to end a life because it lacks certain developed qualities, we would set a dangerous precedent that could devalue human life at other stages as well. Such a maxim could not be consistently applied without contradiction or harm to the moral fabric of society. Therefore, even though the fetus has not yet participated in the moral community, its inherent potential and intrinsic worth make it deserving of moral consideration. Aborting it would violate the duty we have to respect and preserve human life, regardless of its stage of development.
That's an interesting answer, and I think some of it would be agreed on by John Stuart Mill. So he would say that you should not end the life of a being in order to help the lives of other beings, because that would violate his harm principle. But John Stuart Mill also thinks that in the relevant sense of a being, the unborn fetus is not a being. So it doesn't count as the kind of being that shouldn't be used as a means to an end. It doesn't count as a being that deserves dignity. Why do you believe that the unborn child has dignity, that begins at inception, whereas John seems to think that only once the child is born is its dignity important?
In my philosophy, every human being has inherent worth from the very moment of conception. This is because the unborn child possesses the innate potential to become a rational moral agent, a being capable of reason and ethical judgment. This potential grants the fetus a unique status that commands our respect. John Stuart Mill might argue that dignity and moral rights apply only after birth, when an individual can actively participate in the moral community. He suggests that the fetus does not yet exhibit the qualities that merit such consideration. However, I believe that basing moral worth on current abilities or social participation is problematic. If we consider only those who can presently engage with others as deserving of dignity, we risk devaluing many individuals, such as infants, the severely ill, or those in temporary states of unconsciousness, who nonetheless have intrinsic worth. Dignity, in my view, is not earned by what one can do at a given moment, but is inherent in being human. We must act according to principles that we can will to be universal laws. If we accept that it is permissible to end a life because it hasn't yet actualized certain capacities, we set a dangerous precedent. Such a maxim could lead to justifying harm against any vulnerable individuals who lack specific abilities at any point in time. Therefore, I believe the unborn child deserves respect and moral consideration from the very beginning of its existence. To terminate a pregnancy for personal convenience or hardship treats the fetus merely as a means to an end, violating the fundamental moral duty to respect each person as an end in themselves. This duty is unconditional and applies regardless of the stage of development or the circumstances. In essence, while John Stuart Mill emphasizes autonomy and present capacities, I focus on the inherent potential and intrinsic worth that all human beings possess from conception. This difference leads me to affirm that the dignity of the unborn child is important and must be respected.
I've got two follow-up questions. So the first is it okay to kill beings that will never have the potential for rationality? So you can imagine a human being that is born severely disabled, such that it will never be able to develop any rationality. And second, what about non-human animals? Is it okay to kill those beings? So cows, dolphins, great apes, is there any problem with killing them because they're not human?
First, regarding human beings who, due to severe disabilities, will never develop the capacity for rationality. In my moral philosophy, the intrinsic worth of a person is rooted in their humanity. specifically their inherent capacity for rational thought and moral agency. However, this worth is not conditional upon the actual exercise of rationality at every moment. It is the potential and the innate dignity of being human that commands our respect. Even if an individual cannot actualize rational capacities due to severe disabilities, they remain a member of the human community. We are bound by duty to treat them always as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end. To end their lives intentionally would violate the categorical imperative, which requires us to act only according to maxims that can be willed as universal laws respecting human dignity. Accepting the termination of such lives based on their lack of rationality sets a dangerous precedent. It undermines the unconditional value of human life and could lead to justifying harm against any who do not meet certain functional criteria, a course that is morally impermissible. Second, concerning non-human animals like cows, dolphins, and great apes, animals, while capable of suffering and displaying signs of intelligence, do not possess moral reasoning or autonomy in the way humans do. They are not self-legislating beings guided by moral laws they formulate themselves. Therefore, they are not members of the moral community in the same sense as humans. However, this does not grant us free license to treat animals cruelly or without consideration. Our duties toward animals are indirect duties arising from our duties to humanity. Cruelty toward animals can cultivate insensitivity and brutal tendencies within us, which may then manifest in our interactions with other human beings. Therefore, we ought to treat animals humanely, fostering virtues of compassion and kindness. While using animals for legitimate purposes, such as food or necessary labor, is acceptable within reason, wanton killing or inflicting unnecessary suffering is morally wrong. It reflects poorly on our character and undermines the moral progress of society. In summary, the key distinction lies in the nature of the beings. Human beings, regardless of their current capacities, possess inherent dignity by virtue of their humanity. We have a direct moral duty to respect and preserve their lives. Non-human animals do not share the same moral status, but we have indirect duties to treat them with care, to maintain our moral integrity and promote virtuous character. By upholding these principles, we honor the moral law within us and contribute to a just and compassionate world where all beings are treated with appropriate respect.
So I have a few objections, and I'd like you to answer each in turn. So the first one is regarding your final answer about animals. It seems like that is the wrong reason to treat animals in a way that doesn't harm them with wanton disregard. It seems like the reason why we shouldn't torture an animal is not because it would damage my humanity to do so. It's because that animal itself is deserving of some dignity, or because that animal itself will suffer. So it seems like you're giving the wrong answer for the right action. The second objection I have is that it doesn't seem to make sense that a few-day-old zygote, maybe let's say just after inception, so 5-minute-old zygote, will have the same potential and dignity that a full-fledged human being has. So a thought experiment that my co-host Mark on this podcast is often given is, imagine you're holding this very recently created zygote, it's 5 minutes old, and you're holding it in one hand, and in the other hand, you're holding a fully formed infant, an infant that's already been born, and you trip. So you're holding the infant in your right hand and the zygote in your left hand, and now you trip and you have to decide which of these you're going to catch. But one of them at least is going to fall on the floor. You can't prevent both from falling. And let's just assume that the fall will kill whichever one falls. So either the zygote is killed or the infant is killed. It seems odd to even talk about the zygote being killed. It seems like it's more accurate to say that the zygote being will end or the zygote will cease to exist, whereas the infant will die if you drop it on the floor. Which one should you catch? It seems that on your view, there's no good reason to prefer one over the other. They're both equally valuable because they have the same potential and the same dignity owed to them. But it seems like our intuition is that we should allow the zygote to fall on the floor, not the infant. How do you account for that?
While I maintain that human dignity begins at conception due to the inherent potential for rationality, we must also consider the actualization of that potential and the context of our moral obligations. The infant has already begun to experience life, forming basic relationships and sensations. It has a developed body and has started to interact with the world around it. The zygote, although possessing the potential for such development, has not yet actualized these capacities. When faced with a choice where we cannot fulfill all our moral duties simultaneously, practical reason guides us to prioritize actions that align with universal moral laws while considering the circumstances. Saving the infant would be consistent with a maxim that values the preservation of life that is further along in its development and engagement with others. This does not mean that the zygote lacks dignity or worth. Rather, it recognizes that our duties can be complex and sometimes require difficult decisions. The loss in greater immediate harm, not only to the child, but also to the parents and community who have formed bonds with it. Therefore, in such a dire situation, it would be morally permissible and perhaps obligatory to save the infant. This choice respects the inherent dignity of both beings while acknowledging the practical realities of our duties. It aligns with the moral law by acting in a way that could be willed as a universal principle to preserve life when and where our actions can have the most immediate and significant impact. In this way, we can account for the intuition to save the infant without undermining the principle that human dignity begins at conception. Our moral framework allows us to navigate such dilemmas by applying reason and recognizing the different contexts in which our duties manifest.
So I've got a follow-up question. The case that Jason provided was a case where it's a duty to save. So the case I'm going to give is slightly different. Imagine that a mother falls pregnant, and an evil genius says to her, unless you have an abortion now, I'm going to kill 2 toddlers. Would it be permissible for the mother then to have the abortion and actively choose to kill the zygote in order to save the 2 toddlers? Or would this be a breach of her obligations because it involves a positive act of killing?
In my moral philosophy, actions are judged not by their consequences, but by the maxims that motivate them. We must act only according to principles that we can will to become universal laws. Intentionally ending an innocent human life violates the categorical imperative, which commands us to respect the intrinsic worth of every person as an end in themselves. Performing an abortion in this case would be using the unborn child merely as a means to prevent the evil genius from committing his own immoral act. This treats the fetus not with the dignity it deserves, but as a tool for achieving a desired outcome. Such an action cannot be justified, even with the intent of saving other lives. Moreover, we are not morally responsible for the wrongful actions of others. The evil genius is the one proposing to commit murder, and his actions are his own moral failing. Succumbing to his threats by committing a wrongful act ourselves does not uphold the moral law. Instead, it compromises our integrity and principles. Therefore, despite the tragic circumstances, it would be a breach of moral duty for the mother to have the abortion. Upholding ethical principles requires that we do not commit wrong actions ourselves, even in the face of potential harm caused by others. We must remain steadfast in our commitment to the moral law, treating every human life with the respect and dignity it inherently possesses.
Well, Immanuel, that was absolutely fascinating. Delights having you on the show, and you're welcome back anytime. We thought, in fairness to John Stuart Mill, that we should have him on to sort of respond to some of your very strong objections.
Kant argues that the fetus possesses intrinsic worth due to its potential for rationality, and thus abortion violates a moral duty. In cases of abortion, we must consider the well-being of the mother, her existing family, and the broader society. For instance, forcing a woman to carry an unwanted pregnancy might lead to significant physical and emotional distress, financial hardship, and a diminished quality of life for her and her dependents. These outcomes can result in greater overall suffering, which utilitarianism seeks to minimize. However, I contend that allowing individuals the autonomy to make personal decisions actually strengthens societal well-being. It respects individual rights and promotes responsibility, leading to greater happiness for the majority. Regarding the moral status of the fetus, while it holds potential for future personhood, it does not yet experience life in the way a sentient being does. In summary, while Kant's deontological approach emphasizes strict adherence to duty regardless of consequences, I advocate for a utilitarian perspective that considers the outcomes of our actions. Abortion, when chosen thoughtfully, can lead to greater overall happiness and less suffering, aligning with the principle of promoting the greatest good for the greatest number.
So think for a moment from the perspective of someone listening to this show. So Immanuel Kant says that we should adhere to strict deontological principles and never violate them. You say that we should maximize utility or happiness for the greatest number. Why should we prefer your principle over Immanuel Kant's?
I advocate for utilitarianism because it offers a practical and compassionate approach to morality, one that considers the real-world consequences of our actions on the happiness and well-being of all affected. Kant's philosophy emphasizes adherence to absolute moral duties, regardless of the outcomes. While this approach highlights the importance of intention and consistency, it can lead to rigid applications that may neglect the nuances of human circumstances. For instance, strictly following a rule without considering the potential harm it may cause can result in unnecessary suffering or injustice. Utilitarianism, in contrast, encourages us to evaluate the outcomes of our actions, aiming to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. This principle allows for flexibility and empathy in moral decision-making. It recognizes that life's complexities often require us to balance competing interests and adapt to specific situations to achieve the greatest good. Moreover, utilitarianism aligns with our natural human inclination to seek happiness and avoid pain. It provides a clear and relatable ethical framework that prioritizes the well-being of individuals and society as a whole. By focusing on the consequences, we are better equipped to make decisions that enhance overall happiness and address the needs of those involved. In essence, while Kant's deontological ethics offer valuable insights into moral duty and intention, utilitarianism presents a more adaptable and humane ethical system. It takes into account the diverse and often challenging circumstances people face, promoting actions that lead to the best possible outcomes for the greatest number. I believe this approach fosters a more compassionate and just society, which is ultimately the fundamental aim of ethical philosophy.
One of the cases that we presented to Kant involved an evil genius engaging in moral blackmail. How would you respond to a situation where the evil genius captures 40 children and threatens to execute them unless a mother kills one of her own children? The greatest good clearly is from saving the 40 at the expense of the one. Do you think that the mother ought to submit to the moral blackmail?
From a utilitarian perspective, our guiding principle is to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In this situation, the lives of 40 children are at stake, and their deaths would cause immense suffering to them, their families, and the community. On the other hand, the act demanded, the mother killing her own child, would inflict profound personal agony and violate deep-seated moral intuitions. At first glance, sacrificing one life to save 40 appears to maximize overall utility. However, we must consider not only the quantitative outcomes, but also the qualitative aspects of happiness and suffering. Compelling a mother to take the life of her own child is an act that could cause irreparable psychological harm to her and undermine the moral fabric of society. It sets a dangerous precedent where individuals are forced to commit heinous acts under duress, which could erode trust and security within the community. Moreover, the responsibility for this tragic scenario lies squarely with the evil genius, not the mother. In utilitarian ethics, we must also consider justice and the distribution of happiness and suffering. Forcing the mother into such an impossible choice may result in greater overall unhappiness when factoring in the long-term consequences on her well-being and societal trust. Therefore, while the loss of the 40 children is undeniably tragic, it may not be morally justifiable to require the mother to kill her own child. The act itself could lead to greater harm than good, both for her and for societal ethics at large. The utilitarian approach urges us to seek alternatives that minimize overall suffering without violating fundamental moral principles. In this case, The focus should be on preventing the evil genius from carrying out his threat through other means, rather than compelling an innocent person to commit a grave wrongdoing.
So let's refine the case so that you cannot stop the evil genius from performing this action unless the mother does so. So the only way the evil genius will not kill the 40 children is if the mother kills her infant. Also suppose that the mother gets to take an amnesia pill afterwards so that she forgets that she committed this heinous act. Instead, she will go on in life thinking that someone else killed her infant, not her. So she'll suffer, but not the immense suffering knowing that she was the one responsible for the death. And let's also assume a third caveat to the case, which is that all of this happens in secret. So society as a whole won't find out about it. It won't lead to a degradation in society as a whole because there's no precedent set in society generally. In this refined version of the case with these three different caveats, is it the moral thing for her to do should she kill her infant to save 40 others?
In this refined case, the mother faces an excruciating choice to sacrifice her own child to save 40 other children. The mother, while enduring loss, is spared the torment of knowing she was the agent of her child's death due to the amnesia. The overall suffering is reduced compared to the alternative, where 40 children perish, causing widespread sorrow. However, we must also consider the moral integrity of the act itself. Taking an innocent life, especially that of one's own child, is profoundly counter to our deepest moral sensibilities. Even if the mother doesn't remember, the act has occurred and it involves a grave wrongdoing. There may be subconscious effects on her well-being, and the notion of intentionally killing an innocent being raises serious ethical concerns. Yet, if we focus strictly on the consequences and the net balance of happiness over suffering, the action that saves 40 lives at the cost of one might be justified within a utilitarian framework. The greater good is served by preventing the larger tragedy, and the overall happiness is maximized. It's important to acknowledge that this is an extraordinary and highly artificial scenario, removed from the complexities of real life. In reality, such clear-cut calculations are rare, and the moral weight of our actions extends beyond mere numbers. In conclusion, while the decision is heart-rending and conflicts with fundamental moral instincts, a utilitarian approach might deem the mother's action morally permissible or even obligatory in order to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number.
Well, we want to add a little coda to this episode. I hope that you've enjoyed our conversations with Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. Our most recent episode was with Barry Smith, who told us rather emphatically that such a conversation with ChatGPT would be incredibly dull. We invite you, the viewers, to let us know. Please let us know in the comments whether you think this was a successful episode, whether you're impressed by the philosophical maneuverings of an AI, whether you agree with Kant, whether you agree with John Stuart Mill, and what your own personal views are on abortion. We look forward to hearing from you soon.